How you doing? Welcome to part 1 of why your stones are off. The number one reason why your stones are not going to weigh what they're supposed to weigh is that the mold sizes aren't exactly true. Now before I go on, I am no way blaming the manufacturer of whatever mold you are buying. Because I work in the plastics industry, I understand that theoretical yield versus practical yield is always different. On top of the fact that there's really no way to make each and every one exactly the same size. Every type of manufacturing there is has something called tolerance, including my own field. When I sell stones, I always tell people there's a 15-pound tolerance. It's usually more like 5, but 15 gives me more leeway, especially when it comes to custom-sized stones and custom-weighted stones. There's always going to be a difference between theory or the mathematics of it and the actual yield of what's going to happen, because there's so many factors. And in plastics and mold making, I'm sure it's no different. Do I know how they make molds for stones? I have an idea. I'm pretty sure they're form molds, where basically they melt a sheet of plastic and they slowly fold it over a form. I assume that's what it is. They may even do a vacuum method, but I'm thinking it's one of those two methods. I can't exactly see a blow mold being made for some of these stones, being the size of them are 22-inch molds and things like that, and that's way too impractical for injection molding, but I really don't know. I'm just guessing. So with all that being said, what I suggest you do first thing if you get your mold, measure it. What I've found is that some of them are off by about 1/4 inch, and 1/4 inch can be the difference of 10 pounds, give or take, under or over. For example, the advertised size of an 18-inch mold, when I got mine, I finally measured it, it was actually 17.75 inches. Now doing the math, theoretically, it should have a volume of somewhere around 3,053.63 cubic inches of space inside this mold. In reality, it only has 2,928.15 cubic inches. Doesn't sound like that big of a difference, but if you do the math out, the volume difference is 125.48 cubic inches, which equates to about 9.6 pounds. Meaning, no matter what I do, there is absolutely no way that I can get it to weigh what it should weigh, according to the manufacturers, that is. And as I recall, an 18-inch mold should produce a stone that weighs about 240 pounds. And when you purchase these molds from various different manufacturers, they're going to advertise them to be able to make a stone that weighs about 240 pounds. Now if you do the math for an 18-inch stone using 5,000 psi concrete, you're going to come up with a theoretical yield maximum of 235 pounds, which is 5 pounds less than what they advertise. But after measuring my mold and realizing there was only 17.75 or 17 3/4, the actual theoretical maximum yield for this stone is somewhere around 226 pounds. It certainly explains a lot. Before you go off and start kicking yourself because you can't get a 240-pound stone out of an 18-inch mold, measure your mold inside diameter, just one of the halves, and then do your math to figure it out. We'll get into some of the math in a later video, but for now, just trust me, if your math is wrong, there's no way you're ever going to get a stone that you want. So always do good math, and be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for the next episode where I'm going to talk about concrete practices. And if you don't, then what's your excuse? How you doing? Welcome to part 2 of why your stones don't weigh what they should. Now in this one I want to talk about one of my biggest pet peeves, and that's people saying that the scale is lying to them. This is a bullshit reason, and stop saying it. Look, your scale, odds are, is pretty on point. I guarantee it. Unless you're using a dial bathroom scale, odds are it's only going to be off by 3 pounds at the most. And if you're curious as to how much your scale is off, grab a 5-pound plate from your gym and put it on the scale. If it's any more than 0.5 over or 0.5 under, then you can come tell me your scale is lying. But even then, use that 5-pound plate to calibrate your scale. That's what I do before I weigh anything on my scale. I take one of my 5-pound plates and I put it on the scale. As long as it's registering somewhere between 5.5 and 4.5 pounds, as far as I'm concerned, that's an accurate stone weighing device. Because let's face it, generally speaking, stones weigh over 100 pounds, some are weighing even 400 pounds plus. You don't give a shit about a half a pound. And if you do care about a half a pound, there's not much you can do about it. So always be sure to calibrate your scales before you weigh anything with it. Because if it shows it's a half pound off, you can factor that in. You know what I'm saying? For instance, if you're trying to weigh a stone and it weighs 175 pounds, let's just say that's what it's supposed to weigh, and you weigh it, it weighs 170 pounds. Take one of your 5-pound plates, put it on the scale. Let's say your scale is 5 pounds off. Let's say it's 5 pounds off on the upper end. That means that anything you weigh is going to register 5 pounds less than what it's supposed to. So, when you weigh 170 pounds, simply add 5 pounds to the scale. It's that simple. If you put on your plate and it says it weighs 10 pounds, now you know you need to subtract 5 pounds from anything you put on that scale afterward. Which brings me to my next point. How often should you calibrate your scale? I calibrate my scales every morning before I use it. So if I'm going to use my scale to weigh myself, I take a 5-pound plate, put it on, make sure it's only about a half a pound off. If it is, I'm fine with that. If it's more than that, I have to factor in that weight. So be sure to always calibrate your scales. And be sure to stay tuned for the next episode, which will be a little bit lengthier and a little bit more in depth, where I'm going to talk about something that's very near and dear to my heart, and that's concrete practices. If you don't, then what's your excuse? How you doing? This is Will from Will Development, and this is part 3 of why your stones are off. The number 3 reason in my mind why your stones will be off is poor concrete working practices. Everything from how much water you're using to how you're settling it inside of your mold. All of these things culminate to create problems with your stones. Forget the weight of the stone being off. The actual quality of your stone will be affected if you don't use good concrete working practices. For my purposes, generally speaking, I use 5,000 PSI concrete. I find that it cures stronger, and I've never had a stone break on me, at least an Atlas stone that is. And I find that the yield value of it is still such that it's not so bad. There's a lot to know about concrete. You can't just jump right into it and start playing with it and think you're gonna get it right the first time. You might get lucky, but odds are you won't. There's so many different weights of concrete. There's so many different types of concrete. There's so many different additives, different manufacturers, and there's a lot to consider before you start working with it. Personally, not endorsed by them by the way, happen to use 5,000 PSI concrete manufactured by the Quikrete Corporation. As far as I know, Lowe's is the only hardware store in my area that carries it, and the other big manufacturer of concrete is Subcribe. Now, I don't really particularly like their 5,000 PSI concrete. It's just a preference thing, but I find that their aggregate is a little too rough, and it's hard to actually get the stone to come out smooth. I've used them in the past. My preference, again, is Quikrete brand. I find the workability is a little bit easier. Now, why use 5,000 PSI concrete? Why not just buy the cheapest stuff you can find? And you know, on the surface, it's a good idea. If you buy the red bag by Quikrete, which is only 3,000 PSI, you're actually gonna come out with a heavier stone because it's denser packed, the aggregate's a little bit bigger, and the workability is just about the same as the 5,000 PSI concrete. It really is. The reason is because it's gonna take a lot longer to cure and be stronger. You're gonna be leaving it in the mold a lot longer, and the risk of it dusting or cracking when you drop it is much higher. It's not curing at as a high temperature as, say, 5,000 PSI concrete, or even 5,500 PSI. And that's not to say you can't use 3,000 PSI concrete. If you do, I recommend you add some sort of strengthening fibers to it, even some sort of acrylic additive that will help it cure stronger and maybe just stick to itself better. Additives. When I make stones out of 5,000 psi concrete, I've learned that you really don't need to add anything to them. As long as you accurately mix it and cure it, it'll be just as strong as anything. It'll be the strongest stone you can make. That being said, you still need to make sure you're mixing it properly. I'm not about to tell you to go out and buy a concrete mixer. I don't even have one, and I make stones as a side, quite a few might I add. And I've got along just fine by mixing it in a wheelbarrow, using my own muscle, and a shovel. Works just fine. But I do understand that some people don't really know what properly mixed concrete looks like. Now, I could give you a visual representation of it, but the problem with that is in different climates, different weathers, it's going to be different. I can't just tell you this is what good concrete looks like, because if it's more humid outside, you can probably get away with a drier concrete, even in a stone mold. Or if you're in a drier climate, you could probably get away with a wetter concrete. In fact, you'll probably need it a little bit wet. That being said, the best guideline I can give you without a visual representation is to simply mix the concrete, slowly adding water. 9 out of 10 times, about 1.25 gallons of water is enough for an 80-pound bag of 5,000 psi concrete, Quikrete brand anyway. And how do you know if you have a good mix? Well, odds are if you've worked it for about 5 to 10 minutes with a shovel, you're gonna have it very well mixed thoroughly. Some other things that help is as you're turning it into itself, take the shovel and tap into it, sort of making cut marks through it. Pick it up, flip it over, fold it into itself again. How do you know when it's wet enough and not too wet? If you take a paper towel, you should be able to touch the concrete with it while still wet and pull the paper towel off. The paper towel shouldn't be soaked. It should show signs of staining from the concrete. You can even do this with your hand. If you touch it, your hand shouldn't be soaked. It should be damp and show signs of staining. Some of the pieces of concrete, the cement, should be sticking to your hand or paper towel. And this is a good representation that you have a pretty good mixture for any climate, whether it's too hot, too humid, too cold, or too dry. There's a bit of a misconception when it comes to mixing concrete. Some people seem to think it's sort of like dirt. It's like wetting dirt and then letting it dry. It doesn't do anything. Concrete is actually a chemical reaction. It requires a proper amount of water with a proper amount of concrete. And if you have too much of one or the other, the mixture will not properly adhere to itself, and it will cause a poor quality product. Much like baking, it's chemistry. And if you don't do the chemistry right, guess what's gonna happen? Dusty, shitty, broken stones. Now in the next episode, I'm going to talk about putting the concrete in the mold, proper practices for that. So be sure to stay tuned for that. Practice good concrete, and if you don't, then what's your excuse? How you doing? This is Will from Will Development, and this is part 4 of why your stones aren't coming out right. In this episode, I want to talk about putting the concrete actually into your mold and proper practices for this. Now, because I make so many stones and I actually sell them, I have to go to a different level of quality than, say, the average person. This isn't to say that if I did the practices I'm going to talk about in a minute, it wouldn't yield good stones. For about 6 months in the beginning, I did these exact practices and it yielded great stones that are still being used today. But I need to be able to work it fast, get it done fast, because people are relying on me to get back to training. I'm going to go over the things you want and need when you're going to be pouring concrete into your Atlas stone mold. One of the best things you're going to need is something to pick the concrete up with. Trying to use a shovel and pouring it into the hole in the top of the mold, you're gonna have a bad time. It's not gonna work. It's gonna pour around everywhere. You're gonna get all these little aggregates everywhere. You're gonna end up wasting a lot of concrete. That's what we have done. Even using a small shovel, I forget what it's called, I think it's a trowel shovel or something like that. Really thin. They use it in gardening. It's a gardening shovel. Even using a gardening shovel is gonna be challenging to get the concrete to pour in there every time. What I did is I just went out and bought a 99-cent funnel and cut off the bottom and basically made the hole bigger. And then I took this little plastic cup I had laying around the house, and I used that to scoop in, and pour it in. Makes it go by a lot faster, makes me waste a lot less concrete. Now, how do you get the concrete to settle? The cheapest way, right here, using your palms. Assuming you've got your stone, your mold, put together correctly, that's a different video series. You should be able to just take your palms and sort of tap the sides of the stone mold and get the concrete to settle. Is this gonna give you the best yield stone? Hell no. Is this gonna get all the bubbles out? Hell no. Pretty much nothing gets all the bubbles out. But you're still gonna wanna settle that concrete manually instead of letting gravity do the job, because it's gonna come out really shitty if you don't. Option 2 for getting your concrete to settle, if you got a little bit more money, maybe you got $3 to go to Harbor Freight and get one, get a rubber mallet and lightly tapping the sides of the mold after every bag you pour about 50 times, just light taps. Light taps. It should sound kind of like that when you hit it on the mold. Just little claps against it. Don't try to bang it. You'll end up popping your mold open, or worse, breaking it. Just light little taps with a rubber mallet all the way around it. It's gonna help it settle. And I recommend doing this after every bag, whether you're using your palms or a mallet. Option 3, little higher end. Maybe you work with concrete already. Maybe you've got one laying around. A concrete vibrator it's changed my world when it comes to making stones. After every bag I pour in, all I have to do is snake down my concrete vibrator, hit it, and you can literally watch all the bubbles slowly come out. It takes about 30 seconds to 2 minutes before all the bubbles come out of each bag. But I know for a fact it's increased my stones. On top of the fact, it's allowed me to make sure that I'm putting as much concrete into the mold as possible. That's important. Now, I mentioned it before in another video, but mixing your concrete. Honestly, I still use a wheelbarrow and a shovel. You can use a hoe, concrete hoe if you want. Doesn't make any difference to me. I don't recommend going out and renting a concrete mixer for the weekend. It's a lot of money for something that you could really save. I mean, hell, I do these things pretty much every weekend. I'm pouring stones. And I still can't justify getting a concrete mixer because they're not that great, especially when you can only do one bag at a time, and especially since you still have to take them out cup by cup and put it in there. Because if you try to pour it right out of a concrete mixer into the mold, you're gonna have a bad time. Be sure you're putting your concrete in a manner that's acceptable, and be sure you're tapping down after every single bag. And when you get to the top of the mold, and you're running out of room, it's a different story. But basically, you just keep putting in concrete, slowly tapping it down, more concrete, tap it down. You may even have to do it by hand and put it in, tap it down. Now remember, the concrete is always gonna sink. No matter what method you use, it's always gonna settle just a little bit more. So once you fill your mold to the brim, come back out after about 20 minutes and put a little bit more on top. I usually say about a palm full, right on top of it, and sort of spread it around. And I guarantee you after 2 days, you'll still see that little center has settled down just a little bit. Is this going to be a problem when you come to pop your mold? Not really. Just chisel it away. It'll pop right out. I promise you, I do it all the time. Thanks for watching. Be sure to stay tuned for part 5, where I'm going to talk about curing, not drying. If you don't, then what's your excuse? How you doing? This is Will from Will Development, and today we are doing part 5 of why your stones are not turning out the way they should. And in this episode, we're talking about curing, not drying. So let's say you've done everything right. You've done your math correctly. You've done good concrete working practices. You've even poured it with good practices, but you're still not getting a good quality stone, or it's not weighing quite what it should. One of the biggest reasons is because there's the misconception that concrete is drying. Concrete is not drying. Concrete cures. What curing is, it's a chemical reaction between water and cement, and it actually causes heat. If you have ever cured concrete or laid concrete in your life, whether it was a driveway or a sidewalk, you can come up to it and touch it, and will actually be warm to the touch. And if you read a bag of concrete, I guarantee you every single bag will tell you the same thing. Cover whatever you've just worked with some plastic. Now, why would they say that? Don't you want your concrete to dry? Like I just said, no you don't. Basically, you want the concrete to stay as wet as it can for as long as possible. Now, that's not to say you should be soaking your concrete, because that's not good either. But to give it an even harder point, the Hoover Dam is still curing to this day. That's how thick the concrete is. Now just imagine that. If you've got 2 inches of concrete laid out, because you just laid out a sidewalk, that sidewalk is going to take somewhere around 2 to 4 weeks before it's totally cured. And that's just 2 inches thick. Can you imagine what the center of an Atlas stone, sometimes up to 12 inches, is going to take a really long time to cure? Now what's neat about this is you can tell when your stone is curing properly or not. You should be able to walk out to your stone after about an hour and a half after pouring and touch it and it should feel warm to the touch. That's the chemical reaction going on, because chemical reactions give off something. Some give off light, some give off heat. This is the latter. After you've poured your concrete in your stone, I highly recommend you cover it with a bag, some sort of bag. I'm privileged enough to work somewhere where we happen to have disposable bags laying around everywhere that are also clear. So I can actually lay it right over top. And what I like to do is just smooth out the concrete just a little bit right around the top. It's going to allow the stone to cure properly because it's going to keep the concrete moist, not necessarily wet. So with all that in mind, be sure you're curing your stone properly. Always recommend covering it up. Some people even recommend saran wrapping the seams on the outside of the mold in order to make sure as much moisture stays inside as possible. I don't take this extra step, but there again, I would never knock somebody else for doing it, because if you're trying to make a better quality stone, the theory says that should help. This leads into my next topic, which I'm actually covering in the next video, because even though this one's been a pretty short one, it's still simple enough. The next topic will take a little bit of time to go over. It probably won't. Stay tuned for the next video, where I'm going to talk about mixing concrete and pouring concrete in different environments and different climates. If you don't stay tuned, then what's your excuse? How you doing? This is Will from Will Development, and this is part 6. Yeah, 6 of the series that talks about why your stones are off. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about concrete in different environments. Now, I happen to live in a great environment or climate for stone making. Florida, tropical climate, 90% of the year. Actually, I'm sure if I did the math, it's more like 75% of the year. But that's not what's important. What's important is I live in a very humid environment, and it's pretty much humid and hot year-round. This is a great environment for concrete because, as we talked about last time, concrete needs to stay just a little bit damp in order to cure properly. And the wetter you can keep it, maybe I should say the moister you can keep it, the better quality concrete you're going to get and the better curing it's going to be. Mixing concrete in humid environments is pretty easy. Well, it's about as easy as mixing concrete ever gets, I should say. Because it's so humid here year-round, basically, I really don't have to even cover my stone molds if I don't want to, because the moisture from the air is enough for the concrete to soak it in and sort of keep itself curing as long as possible. But maybe you live in a drier environment. Maybe you live in a colder environment. These places are where you need to start really considering, is it a good time to be pouring concrete? I had a conversation with somebody one time and I said, curing and pouring concrete up north is a pain in the ass. They said, yeah, I imagine it takes a really long time to cure. I said, shit, no, that's the easy part. You can just add some calcium to your concrete to work it in colder environments. But let's say you live somewhere where it actually gets below freezing every once in a while. Florida never does. You're gonna have problems, because what happens to water when it freezes? It pushes things away. So if you have water inside your stone, which you pretty much always will, then when that water freezes, it's gonna crack your stone open, man. That's not good. And if you ever lived up north, you'll know one thing. When the summer months hit, everybody's laying concrete. Probably a good 6 months of non-stop concrete laying. Because in the colder months, it's just not worth it because the risk of it cracking is way too high, or the workability is just too much of a pain in the ass, honestly. Now, I know I just said that pouring concrete in a warmer and more humid environment is better in a sense. It still represents its own challenges. You need to sort of factor in the humidity just a little bit if you're doing these outside, because the humidity can actually soak into the stone, which is sometimes a good thing. But if your stone is already perfect, let's see, the perfect amount of to water ratio, and it absorbs some more of that humidity, it's going to cause it to not be a good mix anymore. And that can be a problem. So if you'll remember back in one of the earlier episodes where I talked about just taking a paper towel and touching it against the concrete before you pour it, and it should stain it but not soak it, this is still a great metric to use for humid environments. That's the same metric I stand by. So how do we fix it though? What if we've already poured our concrete, one bag, and that bag was too dry? Do we just pour water inside the mold and hope for the best? No. If you poured it and it's too dry, your first bag was too dry, I recommend just making your second mix a little bit wetter. What's the metric for that? Take your paper towel, touch it, it should absorb a little bit past what you touched, almost soaking in. What's going to happen is the water is going to slowly seep in and it's going to absorb in. And as long as you're doing good practices and knocking it down and settling it properly, the concrete from the bottom will soak up. Now let's say you have the other problem and your first bag was too wet. You just pour in concrete dry to make it soak in. No, this is not good because this is not mixed. See, because even if it's too dry or too wet, at least it was mixed. If you just put it in there, it's not going to mix properly because it wasn't mixed. So I recommend just mixing a slightly drier bag and putting that in next. And you'll find that once you tap it, you'll still get some of the water to seep up. So once again, I'm Will from Will Development. Appreciate you watching and look forward to the final episode where I'm going to talk about why your math is shit. If you don't stay tuned, then what's your excuse? How you doing? This is Will from Will Development, and this is part... oh shit, this is part 7. I said it was part 6 last time, didn't I? What a dick. Oh well. Part 7 of why your stones aren't the way you want them to be. And this one is all about why your math is shit. I have had conversations with numerous people trying to make their own stones, and sometimes they're trying to get the stone to weigh more than it really should. They're taking an 18-inch mold, which should yield somewhere around a 220-pound stone. Somewhere around a 230-pound stone. And they're basically just going off the idea that, well, if I know it weighs 230 pounds and I put 40 pounds of metal, that'll work, right? Well, no, it's not that simple. You need to figure out how much concrete it's going to displace, make up for that displacement factor, and then add to it. Now, this episode is a little bit of a special shout out to Brian Alsrup. I know my man's been trying to make a big-ass 400-pound stone for quite a while now. And his last one came out just shy by about 10 pounds. So he got closer this time. I've actually had some conversation with him after he put out his last video and did all the math for him as to why it didn't come out the way he wanted it to. And I, in fact, did the math for him there too and told him he would almost need another 30 pounds of metal in order to make up for that extra displacement and to make it weigh what he wants it to weigh. So this brings me to my main point, which is that you need to do your math. You can't just willy-nilly throw the shit in. You're gonna end up wasting materials. Lead is cheap. It's hard to melt though. Plates, on the other hand, aren't that cheap to just throw away in a stone. And I personally would never waste a plate unless I had to, and unless I knew my math was right. So, what do? Well, you need to figure out what you're gonna cast your metal into, and you need to figure out the volume of that container, because that's the important part. Then you need to know how much the material you're using weighs per cubic inch. Figure out how much that's going to displace, then you can do the math to figure all that out. It's really not as complicated as it sounds, and I'm going to do one whole separate video where I talk about the math of stones, and I will put a link to that in the description below this video. So if you're curious how to do the math on the stones, figuring out the cubic inch of the stone, the weights per ounce or per pound, then turning it into the weight per cubic inch of said material, check out that video below. But don't ever just start pouring and assuming you've done enough. You need to do your math, because if you make your theory as tight as possible, the practical will be as close as possible. Thank you for watching. I hope some of these videos were of some kind of information to somebody. If they were, I implore you to subscribe down below to my channel, Will Development. I intend to do many more videos on stone making, since I basically am the best stonemaker in Florida, and I feel like I've got some wisdom to impart. And I wish you the best of luck in making your own stones. If you have any questions on anything stone related, whether it's making, whether it's mixing concrete, whether it's what brands of concrete I like, hit me up, send me a message here, leave a comment down below, and I will do my best to get back to you in a timely fashion. So happy stone making, and if you don't do your fucking math, then what's your excuse?